Jennifer Besselo, Director of Middle School Supports.
Darcy Krause, Director of Elementary Supports.
And Rick Henry, Director of High School Support.
So one of the things that has to happen is that the goals have to then be aligned with the KISA vision. So you and I were talking a little bit ago about how we see that happening. Do you want to maybe share some of that with the board? I think it's this has been a topic of conversation that I've seen, on a statewide level, districts trying to figure out how to take their existing goal structures and fit them into this new accreditation model.
So behind the scenes, we've been having several conversations around what we do day to day and what our goals, based on the feedback, how it fits in. And we strongly believe that everything that's on here and then everything that has been mentioned does fit in. So once we know the direction and the priority of the board, we will, the next document would be the overlay between this and the goals. So what I envision and what I've shared with a few, and we will have conversations around this, is this side of the document where this is probably where we would use some of our acronyms and keywords. So where it says relationships, I'll jump down to staff and families. Since we are looking at PASS, which is engaging families, or our equity advisory counselor, we would attach those keywords on this side. And then the back side would be the actual goal and how we're going to measure or hold ourselves accountable, connected to these areas, so that it's a direct correlation. And there are some more creative and visionary people who can help bring that to life, but that is what I imagine is just attaching our initiatives or whatever to each area. And there will be some where there's overlap, like our student support system or CI3T, that would cut across, responsive culture, relationships, and we would just highlight that. And on the back is where you would see the actual goal or what we were doing, and also some way to show how we're measuring that or checking in or holding ourselves accountable for those components.
So just a question, if we're looking at your draft board goals, there are 4 with, a few sort of sub items. What's it gonna look like when it's in this form?
So what we were going to try to do is to move away from that. So if you look at the broad goals, they're the exact same goals that are in the columns on that. So like number 1 is number 1. Yeah, so they're the same goals. We're just focusing. So I would imagine instead of this longer chart, that's where at the bottom where it says next step, convert objectives to SMART goals, we would see where there's overlap and have some broader statements that we would just try to make sure that it's on one document, and all of the steps that we're doing or all the things that we are doing would necessarily be flushed out there, but you would be able to look at the bigger SMART goal and know what we're doing. And that's what would drive the board reports to give the progress on the goals.
I just keep my own microphone. Okay, so then that leads me to kind of the next step, which is with this sort of 2017, what we think we've done. Is that then a list of things that you're proposing to remove from this larger document? And if so, what happens to those things that are still really in process?
Okay, so I'm going to jump in before Anna answers that, because in planning for today, and we had some conversations about this too, one of the things that I have proposed as part of a broader look at where we are headed, since this is somewhat of a transition year, is that we really needed to hyper-focus on the essentials. And so my understanding of this is that it really reflects what staff and the gathered feedback from LEA and everything really is, we're hyper-focusing on this. My suggestion would be that then going into next year, once we have hired the next superintendent, that we actually come up with a plan with our new superintendent to engage somebody to help us do a real strategic plan, something that would be a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. And then I think at that point, my thought would be that you would go back to this and say, okay, we had a year where we really were focused on the essentials, but there are definitely some things that we've talked about in this document that maybe we then look at, okay, do we need to bring this back in to a longer strategic plan and make sure that we've not let something fall away that we wanted to be focused on. I was just thinking as part of that, when we first started doing this, when I first joined the board, and I think probably you started 2 years before that, when we first hired Dr. Dole. The first year I was on the board was the first year that we came up with that structure of excellence, equity, and engagement, and we really wanted to try to focus the goals around those 3 themes. We kind of moved away from that, but in thinking about how all of this works together this year and next year, I think what that really is for us, if we continue to believe that those are the core principles, we need to be talking about rewriting our mission and vision statement to incorporate that language rather than having it be, here's our equity goals, here's our engagement goals, here's our excellence goals, because as we've seen over time, there's so many of them that cut across all 3 of those areas. And so that would be how I would see the kind of shorter version of what are we really focused on this year play into what happens to this, because I don't think that we're going to have this year based on what we've been talking about in terms of needing to really pare back on the number of, and in some ways I think I've heard people say, well, this is more like a task list than it really is a set of goal statements. And so trying to move back toward having the work that we do be more goal statement focused.
Because
Everything you said about strategic planning, all of those things, I don't really think that answered my question. But my curious, we're not going to.
So no, that's what I was going to say. So there are, it's not on there because some of the things it's like maintaining. It's just a part of what we do. So we have expanded the AVID program and strategies. We're still going to do AVID, and there are things in place where AVID, it just happens. Not, people are doing stuff. It still takes time, but it's not like when you were first introducing it and you have to do all of this background stuff. But there are new things that come along, and that's it's the maintaining of it. So there are things on here that will definitely continue, like actually a lot of them we'll still do recruitment fairs, and we just have specific place, so it's not gathering which universities have the most diverse staffs, making those contacts. Now we just register and we go to those fairs and we continue that. So a lot of the things that are on here, they're still going to happen. It's just so we need to put some intention into embracing a culture of transparency. So that because that's not, necessarily just something that we do currently, or the perception that we do that. So that's the difference. Like, those things will still happen. They just will not necessarily require all of the background and planning, because the pieces and parts are put in place to maintain them, to address them, to adjust it. how I see. Now, like launching the one-to-one iPads at the middle school, they're there. It's just the next step. We don't have to launch. So that kind of thing, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I had a question about the board goals and objectives for 2C. Just making sure I'm understanding that. It says engage students, staff, parents, and community members in defining effective communication and transparency. So that's just a first level thing, and then what do we do with that?
Yeah.
at that
So
point?
I imagine, so as we go through this, B and C would be collapsed into one, because one of the things, as I've talked to individuals, different individuals, and maybe several of you as well, what one person defined as communication or being transparent is different. So if we have a common understanding as we're embracing this, then as we are engaging the equity advisory, the district site council as building principals are engaging their specific communities, what is that missing piece where people feel like that we're not being transparent or we're not communicating? So Vanessa shared an example earlier of the board reports is something that has come. Is that something that we need to do? What does that look like? Is that transparent for who? Like, so just as we are having discussions and working through this with different stakeholders in the community, figuring out what is what people are perceiving that we're not being transparent around. And then in the cases where we can be transparent, but if it's a legal reason we can't, then explain that. So B and C technically will be collapsed into the broader statement around embracing and communicating.
So,
And,
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
The other component that we're doing, it's we didn't include it as a goal or objective, is Julie, myself, and Shannon, and Leah, I think Leah was there, and we had an initial conversation with Patron Insight, because one of the things that we got back from the equity advisory in Delta was to do a student and parent survey around just the school experience. So that survey and engaging individuals around that, and the parts of that survey would give us some information around communication, what is transparency. So that's where we'll gather some of that data and then talking face to face with individuals as well.
So thinking about the issue of transparency, I actually am not sure I agree that we should be, that we don't have a culture of transparency to create. A culture it's a shift, and I think that has not been our culture. There are things that the board officers know that I as a board member don't know. There are things that I know that other people out there know, and I'm sure there are things that those folks know that I don't know. So I don't know where you where you draw the line in terms of how much is too much, but I think that and for example, when you talk about a school climate survey, which you just did, I think that maybe that's the first time some people had heard about that. So I don't know what the solution to that is, and we don't want to overload people, but I do think that we need to think pretty carefully about how we communicate information. I mean, you give us a Friday report, which is great. Maybe that's something that should go out to the community as well. Now, obviously, if there's sensitive information, that could always be communicated separately. But maybe the community doesn't care. I'm not sure. But I think those would be the kinds of things that we should think through in terms of really creating a culture. Because I agree with Vanessa. We don't have anything to hide. But clearly that's not the perception of some people in the community. And so if we have to take the extra step to do that and to really create a culture, embrace a culture, then I think that's worth thinking through.
Just quick clarification on some of the previous goals and initiatives. So, health and wellness initiatives, those related to, you know, both to the staff as for their own well-being, as well as just incorporating into curriculum some sustainability initiatives. So, are those kind of more task level at this point? Most of those to the point
And
where
I'll
it's
let
normal?
Denise and Paula chime in, but I will say that we have like the pieces and parts in place. There are some things that funding-wise we need to work on, but I think that was shared. But I think, again, to me, that's more like a maintenance and addressing it within. It's not like, you know, foundationally before Denise's position and Paula and all the work, the guard, all those things were the piece. And if I'm wrong, Paula and Denise, speak up. I think the pieces and parts are in place where that's not an area, like we're not going to stop doing that, and they have lots of plans and goals this year, but does it I don't know, does it need to be there? It didn't, it came up, but I think we just have the mechanisms in place to address the areas and to keep improving, but I could be wrong.
That's absolutely right. We received a USDA grant, and so we are in the midst of hiring a facilitator to take us to that strategic planning stage so that we have a wonderful community that expects a lot of wellness initiatives, but we find ourselves zigzagging. We get funding, we go here, and then we get funding and we go here. We want a comprehensive plan for our community that says, hey, great idea, funding is nice, but that's phase 2. Phase 1 is this foundation. We're going to complete the gardens, outside areas, or whatever that might be. But we are looking for a facilitator to help us through that process. And that's why we wrote that USDA planning grant. And that's an 18-month grant. So, anything else? Does that help?
Quick follow-up on the sustainability. I know that I think Tony was in the process of kind of doing an assessment, a district-wide assessment of our practices at this point to see where we are from a sustainability standpoint. I don't know if this is something we need to shift to a back burner, if it's far enough along that they can provide a report, if it, you know, so it needs to go on here, or, you know, I'm not, you know, I don't know, Tony's not here, so.
As we continue some of those things are naturally happening now as you how we do things or what we do. So Tony can talk more in depth about that, but I do remember having a conversation with him regarding just as we build new facilities or update our facilities with the bond, as you think about like the lighting and those kind of things, some of those things are just naturally what we do. So a report, he can definitely give one, but I'll wait till he comes back and defer to him for the specifics.
Can I say something really quick first? Okay, because this just kind of piggybacks off of what Marcel was saying. You know, I do think that this is a year where we're streamlining, we're focusing, and I get that. And so, but it'd be helpful, I think, to have some sort of like parking lot idea or item. And I think sustainability has been kind of shoved to there quite a bit just because of the nature of being in Kansas with public schools that are underfunded, they don't have enough resources, it's hard to focus. But, you know, I just got back from a trip and was in the Pacific Northwest and up in Canada. And when you go to the Seattle airport and you have like your garbage that's being sorted and they're composting food waste at the airport, and then you come back here and you see like everyone just kind of throwing everything away, and we do such a poor job of even sorting our recyclables here in the Midwest. I think we could be a leader in this kind of area, and I think it's the direction we're going to have to move if we're going to continue to sustain human life on this planet. And so it does seem as though before too long we're going to have to drink the Kool-Aid and start like doing environmental stuff in a much more intense and practical and pragmatic way. And so it does seem like not this year, but a parking lot item. I'm looking at sustainability in kind of a, not just like let's replace the light bulbs when we do new construction, but rather holistically, how can we decrease our footprint as an organization? And you know, we've had quite a few community partners that have pushed us a lot. I know that there have been really cool projects that have come out of elementary schools, and even I think one of the high schools did like a food waste audit. And so there's little things that are happening, but I think we are going to be pushed at some point to bite this off in a much bigger way, not this year, but hopefully soon.
Jessica, do you mind if I take just a second to address? Okay, I don't mind. You were waiting patiently. I appreciate that. So I think that the idea of having a parking lot kind of list is really, really great because it ties into exactly what I was talking about earlier about needing to do a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. And this, you know, the things that we put into that then become the basis for that discussion when we get to have it next year. So, so sustainability, and I agree that's, you know, we've talked a lot about that in facilities, but it hasn't really, we haven't come up with like the broader plan yet. And so that's a good one to put up there. And there's probably there's probably some other things in this bigger document that belong there going forward. We want to make sure you're heard.
Okay, so kind of on sort of piggybacking on sort of drilling down a little bit on specific groups within the district. You know, I'm looking at this item that says, you know, we're developing an improvement plan for special ed, and I guess I'm curious where we are with that. Well, how does that fit into the goals in general? I'm assuming it's going to be part of the greater strategic plan for, you know, it's not really beyond diversity. So where does it fit into equity work? Because that is a fundamental piece of what we heard and what, you know, when I came here at the Ready to talk about sort of my top 3 things, that was one of them. So I'm really curious where we're going with that, and then sort of also this notion of how are we as a board going to be, because I'm all about drilling down, keeping really clear, calm, you know, few goals. But at the same time, that can't wait a year. So where are we with that?
Well, I would tell you, we are continuing to look at it, so it's not something we stopped doing. We've done the program evaluation. We've started, and through the program evaluation, we've looked at, actually we started a teacher leadership team to look at that data. We're in the process of also creating a parent advisory group. And
so is there a reason why we couldn't use the equity team as an advisory group to vet that work?
Well, yes and no. There are some specific guidelines around parent advisory, special education, because it's special education parents, students with disabilities. And our discussion is to have someone from that group also be on the larger equity group. So we're in that process. We've had discussions about the parent group. We haven't started it yet. Our thought is that we will start that next year. We were able to get the teacher leadership team and looking at our report and some of our training around professional development, what our students need. And we are also, at the beginning of the year, we're bringing a group of paraeducators together to talk about what their needs are as far as training.
Just to keep it on the radar, because I think it's something we heard about at length this last year, the notion that we do not have the correct percentage in our AP courses and things like that that are a mirror of what our actual student population is. And so I hope that there's a plan to address that specifically.
And we will continue to address those things. Some because in special education, it's each individual student, and it really depends on what specific parents and the data, and student needs specifically are based on, I guess unless you're talking about gifted.
I'm not. I'm talking about your general population of students, but then it's in your report, right, these numbers come out.
Right. And those things are, and that's a little, it's difficult to apply numbers to certain things that are happening. Because when we talk to parents and when we look at the data and look at the evaluations, everything we do for a particular student is based on that information. Those are part of the legal requirements. And being in those specific classes, that's not about special education. It really is about building culture and providing support to those students.
Is that something, Jerry, maybe you can speak to a little
Because
bit?
I think those are two separate issues, right? I think the whole over-identifying special education. Sorry.
Right, for the ones that we should look at it, because I think that's, doesn't mean better to. Is it a teaching and learning question? Right. And, or is it on your radar, and how are you looking at it right now?
It is on our radar, and we are having discussions about that, making sure we're talking with high school principals. We're also talking with the College and Career Center about how we can serve more students and the individualized plans of study. I think some of those things can really help move kids in those directions, making sure that we're talking to kids about what it is that they're passionate about, where they want to move. So I think all of those things do fit.
The plans of study are something that as we work with our teachers, especially at the high school level, the 8th grade and high school level, about options for students, because we've had discussions that we feel that we've missed a group of students as far as their future and what their plans are. And so we've actually sat down with Patrick Kelly and that group to talk about what the future looks like and how do we support students. I will tell you, last year we had several students that were at the Career College Center and that we were able to provide supports and will continue. But part of it is I do think that the plans of study, those type of things, really help us focus early on what students need. A lot of times those discussions don't happen to their junior year. Our plan would be they happen at 8th grade and 9th grade, and there's a process.
Career cruising helps with that as well, so kids can take assessments to find out what it is they like. I will say, though, that this takes a lot of human support to make this happen. This doesn't just happen with the teachers, you know. It takes a lot more support, and it takes a lot of support away from our counselors as well. Patrick Kelly worked hard with our counselors this past year to start the plans of study, so we are in the infancy there. But it is going to take a lot of people.
And it is a team thing, because all of our special ed students, part of special education requirements is that the transition process that starts at 14. So our students in special education, when they're at middle school, all of our students are required to start career cruising. And in the past, they started earlier. But as a district, we move forward, they're included with all students, and it is that support. Yeah. And then all of our teachers, our secondary teachers, are required the transition focus in using that data. So I think that as we move forward, there are a lot more options. And as we, especially looking at the Career Technical Center and some of the options out there, we feel there's a lot more options for some of our students that we've not been able to provide in the past.
I think one of the, so I think there's two kind of goals that you're talking about, or two objectives, I guess, right, that would be specific and measurable. So I think having these kind of show up in the SMART goals that are developed would be helpful. And one is to try and tackle the issue of over-identified students of color within special education programs. And I recognize that it's, you know, laws determine who qualifies and who doesn't. But we also know that in our country, there's a lot of just stereotypes and beliefs and other things that go into that process that cause the over-identification. And it's not actually the fact that there are more students of color who have special needs, but they're over-identified as such because of all of these other social problems that we have. And so, you know, it's going to take a lot to deal with, and we all kind of get that because we've all been through Beyond Diversity, right? And other types of programs and red books and whatnot. But, you know, I think that a SMART goal around that, because we want to track it. We want to know, are we making progress? Are we decreasing the number of kids that we're identifying within certain subgroups? And is that more reflective of what we would expect if these problems were gone? If institutionalized racism was removed from our district, what would it look like? And then the other would be, how many kids in the general population, which includes special education, are actually taking advanced placement classes and other things, which isn't necessarily something that your special ed audit would look at, but it would be another thing that would be helpful to track, because I think that that's one of those things that as a district, when we're looking at just some basic numbers for are we making progress in the areas that we care about making progress in, those would be two pieces of information that would help us determine whether or not we're moving in the right direction. Is that right?
And I do think it's a discussion, because just looking at numbers without looking at individual student needs you won't get the correct information. It is more of a discussion of what is this like, and then what type of students, and that's something we look at, which students do have access. And part of it is also the identification process is about our CI3T process, because part of it is for all students, and especially our students of color. How do we support students before it becomes an issue? Because when we're looking at learning disabilities and those type of things, we should be able to support students before they're identified. There's some disability categories that there's nothing we can do about it. It's just a student has autism. They have autism. But how we support those students. But our process of CI3T, that our tiers, tier 1, tier 2, those are the things that's important to support students before they fail or before they fall so behind, because not all students with disability need a special education or need to be identified. It's just a matter, if we're not able to support them, they need specially designed instruction to get that support. But why can't we provide some of that support prior to them being identified as special education? They may need it. They may still have a disability, but they don't need to be identified as special education.
Adding to this notion that is a bigger conversation piece, especially for the second thing, that we're talking about, which is if you look at the general population, how do you get more kids of color in these AP courses? My son, who's obviously a white male, is also doesn't get great grades, but he's very intelligent. And so the reason he's taking an AP course next year is because a specific teacher pulled him aside and basically had a very heart-to-heart conversation with him about effort and things like that. And I kind of feel like it really might just boil down to individual conversations of teachers with students of color that they believe in, despite the fact that they might be a D average, C average student. It doesn't mean they couldn't excel in a class with the teacher that they respect. So it is a larger discussion piece, but it's one that the community is looking at.
And I would
just
agree
think we
with you.
can't
Having two
ignore
girls
it.
in high school, I would agree with exactly what you said.
So I know you've thought about this, but I'd be curious as to kind of what the thinking is. Clearly, when you talk about these disparities in AP classes, for example, you focus on the high school level, but these things start before high school. Arguably, they start in third grade. So what's the kind of thinking about how you address those kinds of issues in a proactive fashion, so that we do we identify kids who we think this kid might be not up to his or her potential? Is this kid at risk? Do they need extra support? What's the focus?
That's our CIT. That is the part of the CIT process from kindergarten through 12, is looking at and finding those red flags in students and providing support prior to an identification process. That's not the goal. The goal is to get them support, because students with disabilities, once they're able to, their accommodations can meet their needs, or they catch up, whatever the case is with a particular student, they should not be identified as special education anymore. They may still have a disability, but they aren't. But it's about the support, and that is our CI3T process starting in kindergarten.
Right, but I guess I'm thinking not about special ed or kids with disabilities. I'm thinking about kids in general. Yeah. It is the case that marginalized groups are underrepresented in some of these like AP classes and those sorts of things. And so, and I know your focus is really on special ed, but is there thinking about how we address that broader population of kids?
That's what it is. CI3 is, hello? CI3T is not special education. It is for all kids. And that's not the special ed. There's a whole different process for special education. CI3T is actually that intervention identification of students prior to issues. So that what you're talking about is our CI3T process and our interventions. And we look at data on a regular basis. And this year our discussion is about having data carousels at schools and talking about the data too, and having things pop out as red flags that you look at. So we have that in process. Well, and that's some of it. Looking through that data and at tier 2, so AVID's a tier 2 intervention for students, and so.
I wanted to add in too that I think with this new focus for the Kansas Vision, there will be more focus on preschool and kindergarten readiness, if we want to focus where we can really get bang for our buck, it's that age group right there. So excited about that. We're thinking about how can we start involving all of our community preschools. I know we're involved now, but ramping it up some. How can we make sure that we're all on the same page and moving forward, because that really is where we can make things happen much quicker. The other area too, I think that this plan is going to focus on, that I'm excited about as a former counselor, is the social emotional piece. Making sure that kids have those social skills that they need. A lot of times it really isn't an academic problem. It's they need to learn those social skills. And so I think when we can have more emphasis on that as well, I think those are two areas that'll really support.
And perhaps this is more of a strategic plan piece than a discussion for this year, but with the discussion about how much more manpower intensive the process of creating these individualized plans of study is going to be, does that then become something that needs to be in our strategic plan over the next few years about, okay, we see a need for increased staffing of guidance counselors or whatever, like that, as they've been talking about creating this model all along, that has been a theme I've continued to hear people talk about. We're going to need more money for counselors. We're going to need more money for people to create these plans and guides, right, and help guide those students. So,
looking at what they are doing now, are we using their skill set effectively? Are we having them doing some work that we could hire someone else to do those kinds of activities? So using them for the skills that they have and how they are highly trained. Social workers as well.
Jared, if we could stick with you for a minute, I have another question on this designing a plan to provide culturally relevant teaching. Can you give a little bit of information about where you think we're at with that, where you hope to be 12 months from now with that, what's happening? How are you going to be sort of thinking about transparency with our community, maybe utilizing our equity council, things like that?
Absolutely. So we are working on we're working on a lot of different areas as far as professional development. And so we're trying to figure out what is the base set of skills that we would like everyone to have and the training that we would like everyone to have gone through. So we heard from our principals loud and clear that some of our PD experiences have been a little too open. We need to say, if when you're coming to PD, you will take a culturally relevant session. You will do a session on this, and then you have some choices as well. Not to take away all of the choice, but to make sure that everyone has the list of things that we feel are important. Our principals feel like we need to make sure that we have those basics down, so we're working together, trying to figure out a plan that will be equitable and can help people to get that baseline. So
Start that this fall, or is that something you're pushing off?
well, we have our August 11th planned, and there are some things on there that we would suggest, but I think we'll probably hit it harder after August 11th. So, yes, yes, absolutely. So we're hearing that from principals as well. Yes, induction was much more foundational to make sure that they have those skills. Thank you, Samry.
So August 11th is already planned, but are the teachers going to be informed that, okay, in the future PDs, this is what's going to happen? Because I think the sooner they know, the more mentally prepared they can be for those sessions. So that wasn't, because that's the thing that I hear amongst people in the community, specifically teachers, like, maybe here at the district level, they already know what they're planning, but we don't know. And then it's just like, oh, okay, by the way, next week you're going to do this. So I think if we can prepare them mentally for what's going to be expected, that's.
I'm going to ask Kirsten to talk a little bit about the competency-based professional development instead of just sitting and getting and listening. We want to see that you do have the skills. So I'll let her talk a little bit about that.
And to answer your question, one of the challenges with that is, again, manpower, because we have 300 staff coming and a designated bevy of learning coaches. And so a lot of times when we do our call for presentations and when those come in, we're kind of at the mercy of what comes at us a little bit with that. So some of the challenge with kind of pre-planning a lot of that is that we haven't received PD reimbursement from the state, so that's all come out of our general fund. So we've just run a little lean for a long time. So that will help, hopefully, that we've got some of those funds coming back in. But one of the things I think maybe in an eventual land as we're looking at strategic planning that we're really looking for with professional learning is this move toward competency-based professional learning. And really there's a lot of background swell for it because it can kind of happen anywhere. I think one of the things that we like to do is say that everybody who's sat through X, Y, or Z is now competent in it and can do the things that they've learned in it. And as we know with students, that's not always the case. So while it's great to have everybody go through Beyond Diversity, some come out with levels of capacity that are different than others. So we're researching and kind of looking at badging and micro-credentials are kind of the way that that's going, that you move through a set of criterion and you can go through it as many times as you need to. Because that's one of also the challenges that we face with professional learning is that if staff choose to use their personal days on those PDs, that's where the learning was, and you missed it. So we're kind of constantly looking at that, and we're looking at platforms that kind of have a bevy of offerings that we can access, and we can kind of point them at, because as we're looking at board goals, sometimes it's a little more challenging to get everybody in the space at a time to hear the message, especially even if we offer culturally relevant instruction. If we offered it on August 11th, that would be for 900 people. So even if we split it into 30 different rooms, you'd hear a slightly different message each time. So those are some of the challenges that we're looking at, and I think competency-based professional learning will help keep our teachers more involved, because if they can develop extreme competence in the compass and the agreements and the conditions, we can take them deeper into something else. Whereas if that's where you are, we can meet your need there. So that's just kind of where we're headed.
We're also looking at some on-demand type programs that you could do virtually. And there are components in those that make sure that there are some competencies and some reflection and that kind of thing, so that we know what they've done and what they understand and can move forward. So looking at a lot of options there.
Okay, so this is all really great conversation. Food has arrived, so let's take a few minutes break. Everybody get something to eat. We'll come back to the table and sit down and continue our conversation while we're having something to eat. Okay, thanks.
Make sure Dawn is ready.
Now that I've announced it.
Dawn, they're about to.
I didn't tan that much. We're gonna go. She said last time we were David? Yes, oh my gosh.
A burn hurts no matter what.
I didn't burn. I wasn't in the sun. The curl did for you.
You weren't in the sun.
No.
How are you not in the sun in Jamaica? Is that a little too personal? Sorry.
Yeah, but an umbrella, yeah.
Okay.
I don't lay out.
Yeah.
Carol did, but I.
But I mean, you don't lay out. You're speaking of the beach.
Yeah, but
You have an umbrella? You had a big umbrella?
if I'm sitting out in the sun, I am under an umbrella.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well,
Yeah.
you're outside. I'm
Yeah,
thinking,
but it wasn't
and
too,
you've got your
and actually,
fruit
it
drink.
wasn't too bad out. So.
Okay.
And we were
It was
outside.
worse
We
here.
even went on the water. I think she makes great bed. Carol had a tendency that anytime we were going to be in a lot of sun, she would be sprayed, so she would spray me. Well, she'd say, you might burn. And she would spray. I didn't complain because I know I don't want to.
Yes.
Not sure what it's like other than my scalp at one time, but.
Never blistered?
My scalp, it didn't blister, it just peeled.
Oh, it's so annoying.
I was like, oh, what's wrong? No, no. She's like, it's the sun.
Get some. Yeah.
I was like, oh,
the board, if you guys came to some consensus about this is it, then we would flush it out and more of connecting it to the KISA and the SMART goals. And there's, I think we were planning for a work session on August 14th. So to have a, if we got that far, to have a draft based off of your feedback tonight of here's what it looks like.
Are we thinking that we're going to need to have a second August board meeting?
More than likely we will, which because of the budget, we're going to have some special meetings. So we don't necessarily have to do it on the 14th. We can look at that. But we won't know that until the court makes a decision. And then we have a timeline that we have to meet. But more than likely, we'll have to have one, maybe two special meetings. If one of them don't align with the 14th, we'll have to have two additional meetings in August. One is to publish, and one is to approve the hearing. So we'll have to have two.
So in terms of your availability, if we put off, didn't do the work session on the 14th, will you be then, I guess school will be starting at the university by then, so toward the end of August. Okay. I'm happy to pass this around. I don't want to sit here holding it. Okay, Marcel.
So I don't know that I had a top three per se. It was difficult to, I mean, I more or less was looking at categories and seeing where staff recommendations fell within those categories. And I think from what I've seen here in the discussion that we've had and what's up on the parking lot at this point, I think for me, the concerns that I had have been addressed, making sure that I agree. I think this year we need to focus on fewer items in this transition year. So I'm okay with that. And I had one other thought here. Let's see, I forget. No, if it comes to me, I'll ask for the mic again.
I have one other thing I'd like to add to the parking lot, since I won't be here next time we do goal setting, and I want my words to still remain. And that is, right, so everyone can't forget that I do think we should take a critical look at potentially expanding food service programming. I know that some districts like Tonganoxie has done like a second breakfast to help increase participation in the breakfast program. And, you know, I think that can be stigmatized for a lot of low-income students because getting to school early is never easy. And so getting to school early in order to have breakfast only because you are someone that that's the only way you can eat is hard. But Tonganoxie does it, and they do it between kind of the first hour passing period, and kids can bring it to their classroom, and it just increases participation, which studies have shown increases learning because then kids have sugar in their brain and can pay attention better. So we might consider that, and then also I know there's a few community organizations looking at potentially after-school meals and what that might look like or do, and I recognize that this year is probably not the best one to focus in on how we can make that work, but I do think we should think about it in the future, and I think it, you know, would easily, some of the work that we're doing enhancing programming and supports to meet student needs, it would work well from there next year maybe.
I do have a top three. So 2 years ago, we adopted, or the high schools were going to put in place the AP Capstone program, and that didn't seem to actually take place. And so we talked about it last year. Angelique was going to look into it in terms of, you know, how other schools do it, because right now, Free State and Lawrence High are the only two schools in the state of Kansas who are listed as having this. So I guess the goal is to find out what's going on with that. That would be one thing. Second thing is, and I don't know quite how to phrase this as a goal, but I'd like to suggest that we have a conversation with the city about buses. You know, we run a bus system, they run a bus system. You know, if kids are 2.5 miles away, they get busing and transportation provided for them. But you know, if you have kids who are 1 mile away or 1.5 miles, and sometimes they don't have transportation, so is there some way to coordinate those kinds of things so that maybe we could make better use and help some of those kids who might struggle with transportation? You know, and so I'm suggesting a conversation, and I don't know if that conversation will yield anything or not, but I think it's at least worth thinking about. And then the last goal is not going to surprise anybody here. You know, if you look at the last goals survey and hold focus groups on conversations with staff, students, parents, to gain modifications, to feedback on modifications to school start times, it's listed as in progress. So I would like to see us, in terms of the high schools, actually make a serious attempt to gather feedback about that. You know, you know, my sense is that the high school community would probably be generally supportive of that, but that's a hypothesis that I think could be tested. I realize there are concerns about staff time, but I think that we have good models in the past for how we've done things using community members. So, you know, the suggestion would be, let's see if we can get a community group together to actually do some of the legwork that's needed for actually gathering the information we need to make an informed decision about that, because we don't have data on that possibility. So those would be my three.
I like the idea about the busing for students, especially, I know there are a few students who go to West and they have to cross that major road. And I know this isn't New York, but, you know, they had bus passes, and students were allowed to use the bus passes during a specific time of the day. The school, maybe an hour before and an hour after. Like they had, yeah, you could do it in the summer, but like if we can extend that, I mean, I know people say, oh, it's a 50 cents, but sometimes kids don't have 50 cents right then and there. But other than that, I think a lot of the items for the goals and objectives on the draft is pretty much aligns with the 3 ideas that I had. Hopefully we can just delve into those next steps after that. But if we're looking at goals, I think I'm sometimes just conjuring up ideas in my mind, and it's not that time, so.
So one of the things that we did not do this past year that I guess I would like to know if the board is interested in trying to do this year is the joint meeting with the city and county. That kind of fell to the wayside with transitions at the city, and then we didn't really pick it up this year. But I think that this conversation about bus service would be an ideal topic to bring to the table at that type of gathering, as well as some things that we've talked about in the past in terms of the idea that providing access to internet, broadband services shouldn't necessarily just fall on the school district. That should be a conversation that we have more broadly with the city. How do board members feel about, because that would really be on me then to reach out to the chair of the county commission and the mayor and try to coordinate that. So if that is something that board members want to do, I will do that. I'm seeing. all right, that will be on my to-do list to try to get their feedback on doing that and some suggested times that we could target for that. And then I will put the busing and the internet issues on the agenda. Are there, I guess, if you have others. It is. It is. Yes, you're right. That's correct. So if you have other thoughts about topics to bring up with that group, please send them to Anna, and we'll work on that.
The timeline you're thinking, because the group of city commissioners that are seated there today may not be the same ones that are there in January.
And that will certainly be true of our board as well. So perhaps we try to have a meeting maybe in October, early October, before elections, and then plan one again after the first of the year when everybody has new members in place. Or do you think we just wait until after elections?
I don't know, but I think in terms of trying to coordinate the bus routes, my worry is that the more people you get in a room together, the less is actually going to happen. So if we could have some conversations ahead of that, and maybe there's no way to do it, and then we don't even have to talk about it, I guess is kind of what I'm thinking.
Okay. Well, and I know that we had received some community input on this issue as well a while back. I don't know if everybody on the board got the email from Linda Cotton. Everybody did. Okay. So I think there's just some follow-up conversations that could be had in preparation for that.
So I'm okay with the goals. I mean, I think for me, my top three were basically equity, 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 and anything we can do in that, in addition to the transparency. And I guess if we're talking like specific action items outside of what we've sort of already touched on, it would be for some sort of actual crisis communication plan to be put in place, thought about, and developed so that if we get into a situation where none of us really know how to respond, we have a sort of a set, here's what is going to happen. And I think that would be really helpful in general for our district to pursue, think about.
And that seems like it would fit within the communication and transparency goals, and
probably this year. So maybe
biggest parking lot or the list that we're going to come back in.
Yeah, it's either parking lot. I mean, I'm assuming that wasn't tomorrow. So putting that in some sort of list. I mean, an organization this size.
Ironic to put the crisis on the parking lot. It should be immediate.
perhaps we need to rename that slide. Refer to it as the strategic plan.
I do think that the idea of developing a plan to share information, obviously that plan has to take into account. So I think that may be part of it.
Yeah, I would agree. Move it to
move it off of the parking
off.
lot.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to be clear.
And that would be tied to 2B/C.
I think my goals have all, kind of being the last one, I think we've hit them all. I'm really happy that we are changing the format of our working document. I've always really been, it's been really frustrating to me to have this be this is to me is like a to-do list and not more like an internal document, not for the sake of lack of transparency, but I like the idea that we're making them clear and more in front of us. And I think Anna helped me at least a few things and work on them and get them done, and that makes me feel hopeful that we'll actually not that some of these are not unending, but we can address them. They're done. We've taken care of them. And I think probably the top goal that I talked about is transparency. And I like your idea about creating a culture of transparency and starting from a place to yes. Because I think especially when you get on the board and you realize there's much more that you don't know than you do know, it is a good philosophy to kind of start with, just to know that we can get the answers for you. We don't know. It's okay to say we don't know. We don't know the right way to do things, but we can find out. So anyway, that's all I have.
And my top 3 priorities are all reflected in the draft: equity, communications, and transparency. And for me, bond issue implementation. But that's no surprise to anybody that would be one of my priorities, I guess. So I feel really good about the work that's been done to put all of that together and really refine and focus what we really want the district to be focused on this year. So I guess then my last question for the board, what time is it? We've got about just shy of 10 minutes. So we've got, yes.
Only because I don't really see it, maybe I'm missing it, and you can certainly point me to the bullet point, but what I didn't see transfer over from sort of the feedback from everybody into this document is sort of that culture piece, that thriving culture within the buildings. That's really a staff morale issue, and so, okay. Okay. I mean, sure, that seems pretty broad, but yes, I mean, maybe if we can suss it out a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So last year at goal setting, I had talked about, we have a really great facilities plan, and between the elementary bond and the bond we just passed, it's going to improve secondary schools. Is there a plan for C-Tran, the Holcomb Center? And who knows, who can talk to me about that?
Kyle and Tony and Kevin a little. So when they
There
were
is a
here,
plan. I mean, I know
there's been discussion. Yes.
Okay, because I think that out of our facilities are ones that you can walk into any of them and be proud of them, and I don't think that's true necessarily for that one, and I don't want that to be continued, but I don't think it has to necessarily go on the goals for that to change.
There is a plan.
There is a plan. Okay. Thanks.
And just to add on to that, we've had some conversations in the facilities planning committee already about thoughts around both where that program needs to end up, what they need in terms of improvements to their facilities, and then thinking about the future of the C-Tran site. Yes, yes. Okay, so I think the last thing that I want to clarify is, so we've got this 3 to 5 year plan slide sheet, and then we have the second sheet that's titled 2017-2018, and I guess.
So from there, because I think some of those things are on there, and this is just my opinion, and I could be wrong, are not necessarily goals, but can be wrapped in, like the conversation with the city about the transportation. That's probably some board members and Ron engaging the city, and I think that's something that can happen naturally. It will be so. What do we want the implementation of the SPED improvement plan? We can definitely build that into something that we already have here. AP Capstone, like we just need to figure out what that is, or I don't necessarily think that's a goal. Like that is something we can definitely, as we're talking about, when we talked about our students not taking AP class, like how do all those things intersect and what that looks like? It's just a matter of what we want to do with that. Are they additions, or that would be my question to the board.
Like, right, and that's actually, I guess, my question to the board, because I think some of it may be wrapped up in work that's already reflected in these goals. Some of it is for the joint meeting. the school start time issue, I think that's the one I need to make sure that we're all clear about exactly what we are talking about doing with that. So there's been the suggestion of asking survey questions. We did meet with Patron Insight at Virginia Planning on Tuesday to talk about this broader climate survey that they're doing, and there's the possibility of asking some questions, survey questions as part of that broader survey. Is that what the board wants to do? I think we need to be very clear about exactly what it is we're doing this year versus in future years.
So I'm supportive of us trying to get that involved in the survey, the larger survey, so that we have something to start from as we think about what was clear to me in the last thing that we got from, I think it was you that gave us that presentation, right? Is it's actually going to be a ton of work. And so if we can get started on the survey, since we're going to do a survey anyway this year, and then that gives us a starting point that's different than the one we have now when we're talking about a 3 to 5 year plan, whether that means next year or the year after or whatever.
So I don't think we can do justice to this issue in the 1 minute we have remaining. But I'm not sure we can do justice in 6 minutes, but that's okay. So I actually favor a separate survey. They're easy to do, and for people who weren't here for the last meeting where we talked about this, part of what we talked about was the Seattle School District and kind of what they had done in terms of changing their start times. So. There was a very good presentation kind of on kind of what that looked like. But it's also important to keep in mind that while the survey that Seattle developed, I think, was a model of how to do a survey, Seattle is a very different kind of school district than we are. I mean, they have close to 100 schools. They have high schools. They have K through 8 schools. They have middle schools. They have elementary schools. They were talking about moving all of those schools. And they were talking about moving school start times back an entire hour. Last year they started at 8:45. This year they're starting at 8:55, so they moved it back even farther. What's driving this is the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation that schools shouldn't start before, high schools in this case, which is what I'm talking about, shouldn't start before 8:30. And that fits into the fact that kids are sleep deprived and that the school schedule doesn't help them with that. So this fits into a number of issues in terms of, I think it's an equity issue. I think if you look at social and emotional factors, I think it fits into that if kids actually get more sleep. So yes, it could be a ton of work, but I don't think it's as much work as it was presented. And part of the reason why I'm thinking, let's get a community group to actually do that legwork, so it's not going to be a ton of work that would occur for staff. And we have models. I mean, we have community working groups. We had whether you call it a task force or a committee or whatever it is, but we had a working group for schools. Elementary schools, we had another working group to see, are we going to close certain elementary schools? So we have models for how to do that. So I think there's a way that you can do it that is not a ton of work, but that gets us the information that we actually need in a timely fashion.
Okay. All right. So I think we've had enough conversation about this issue already to know, that people probably are aware of where I am on this issue. So I'm going to make a suggestion. I think that the right way to approach this is we ask some questions on the survey that we do with Patron Insight, and we put the remainder of whatever work comes out of that, based on the feedback we get, into our strategic plan. I don't think that we need to undertake this year. I disagree with Rick about the amount of work and what it really means. I also think that talking about this kind of change in our school district, the discussions need to be led and and heavily involve our staff. And so I don't know that having other people in the community come in to do that work is going to be helpful, because ultimately it's our staff that has to implement this, and that is going to be impacted by it, and our parents and our students. And so I'm going to make that suggestion because there is some disagreement amongst board members about what to do with this. I think we need to go back to what we talked about when we did goal setting last year, which is if it's going to move from one place to another, we need to have more than a couple board members saying this is the way I want to do it. So I'd like to get people's either we do what Rick is suggesting, or we do what I'm suggesting, or make a third suggestion, so that we can kind of put this to rest as to what we are going to do in this upcoming year. I think it's really important that we make a decision about it one way or the other.
Well, I would agree. If we're going to gather information, we gather it from one source. And I maybe I don't understand your hesitancy to go with patron insight. Thank you.
Patron insight.
But I think I think if we're conducting the survey, that's the tool that we've chosen to communicate with parents, community, staff, whoever. So I guess I would think that would be the best way to gather information. My concern about changing a start time would be that we definitely need community buy-in. And I know this is a super long time ago, but there are still people who are upset about the way early release was brought on, which was through negotiations, which had no public comment. And I really feel strongly that if you're changing families' individual daily life, we really need to have conversations with that. But I guess the main point would be that I really think we should go with patron insight if we're going to be gathering all this other information, so we can kind of have it all analyzed together.
I would agree with Shannon's proposal.
I think that if we want something done sooner rather than later, that we should go ahead and incorporate it with the patron insight. Because if we have like numerous surveys back to back, I don't think we're going to get the same response anyway.
So my concern about patron insights is that I don't know what the survey is going to look like in terms of how adequate it's going to be in terms of addressing those questions. I mean, I know that
I wouldn't interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I was going to say when I shared that this may come up, we did talk about whatever survey or whatever information you having some input on seeing the questions and those kind of things, and having some input there as one option if we were to go that way. I just asked them, was that a possibility, and they said yes. So
sure.
I would certainly advocate that you were involved in trying to organize those questions and make sure that Patron Insight heard what you wanted to say, because this is such an important issue to you. So I think that that's a totally valid thing.
I just want to say I think it's an important issue to high school kids. I mean, if we can do it and actually do an adequate job of surveying people about that, then that's fine. I mean, the only thing I'll point out is that the Seattle survey literally takes 3 minutes. So even if you did a separate one, you wouldn't be, I don't think, overburdening people. But if you want to wrap it into that and we do an adequate job, then fine, we get the information. But I also think it's the case that it shouldn't be just a survey. I think that we should be talking to the site councils and the Boys and Girls Club and other relevant groups, because it is the case that yes, we can get the information about what people kind of where they are, but you do have to build support for this, and I think that's something that community members can do. So we've certainly when we passed the bond, we had community members talking about the benefits in trying to get people on board. So I'm fine with the survey if it's truly representative in terms of patron insights. But I also think that we need to think about how we can actually go out there and engage the community, because it shouldn't be just the survey. I think that's a problem.
I want to give Vanessa and Marcel a chance to. I really do want some direction from the rest of the board as to which option are we choosing. Are we doing more than a survey this year, or are we just doing a survey and putting this on our strategic plan for follow-up?
I do think, I mean, it sounds like if 5 people already think it's good to be part of the survey, I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of trying to get this plan or any kind of plan marketed to site councils, I think in the past we've tried that, and we all have assignments of 3 schools that we're the liaison to, and it's just a matter of whether or not board members make a priority to go out and actually sell any kind of idea. But I do think, you know, is the Patron Insight Survey going to be given to everybody, or is it going to be given to like the, you know, statistically?
So when we talked, and Julie and Shannon can chime in, there was, they'll do the phone component, they'll do staff, and then the phone is like community, and then parents. So they were layering it, so we can talk about what that looks like or how it can look. They were open to us, so it wasn't anything set in stone. It was just broadly, how is this too many different topics? And they were like, no, schools do this all the time, because we even talked about getting characteristics for, you know, the future. Like there were different, so that all of that stuff could be created. So when whatever the board decides with search, when you get to focus group, you would already have all of this background information to engage in what the trends came up as, what the community was saying that they needed or wanted around different topics.
And we're surveying students.
Students is
separately.
Yes.
Okay.
We're partnering with KU to do that survey.
And can that survey include information about school start times as well, or is that completely separate?
We haven't talked to them about that, but it's
okay.
It's a survey that for students that they 2 times a year.
Okay.
Okay.
So, but okay, and I'm happy to go and talk to site councils. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I do think before the survey launch, or, you know, if we're going to do a survey and we want to try and get, you know, the numbers of people to participate up, I do think that having that be kind of our assignment for touching base with our site council early in the year would be highlighting how we're trying to get information. We want people to answer their phones or send in the mail or whatever it is, however they get it.
And I'm going to talk about those assignments during my president's report tonight. We can do that.
So I know we're running a little over time, but you know, there are ways you can construct a survey so that if the focus is on high school start times, you can direct those questions to high school parents. So that's actually really easy to do. But I think the other survey we do need, and this can be separate, and that's easy to do as well, is we need a staff survey of the high school staff. So we need to obviously get what their impressions are as well. And so that's
it's part of it. It's part of what they would do.
But
they're gonna break out the survey work by level, elementary, middle, high school. That we had that conversation about how they approach the question. So they might, depending on what level you fit into, you might get asked different questions.
That's fine. But in terms of staff, I would ask staff very different kinds of questions than I would about the start time issue than I would about parents.
Right.
And so, you know, and again, it's super easy to construct one of these surveys and to send it to people. So, but I do want to highlight that the staff needs to be a part of this.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think we've provided some direction to Anna and staff about how that all fits together. Do you feel comfortable with that? Okay, we are a couple minutes over our time. Do we want to take a break now, or do we want to break at 6:45 from executive session and have a little bit longer break before the meeting? Okay. All right, just go to it. All right, then we're going to move on to that, and I've got the motion for executive sessions I move the Board of Education recess to executive session to protect the public interest in negotiating a fair and equitable contract, to discuss negotiations with Anna Stubblefield, Jerry Kimball, David Cunningham, Kathy Johnson, Sammy Devon, and Matt Brungart, invited to be present, and with the board to return to open session in this room at 6:50 with possible action to follow.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Okay, thank you.